Have you ever wondered if the clothes we see in Bible movies are historically accurate? How did people actually dress in the time of Jesus 2,000 years ago? Did everyone wear clean, white tunics, or was reality much more colorful and complex? In this documentary, we are going to discover the materials, colors, and social significance of clothing in Jesus' time. From sandals to mantles, we analyze archaeology to understand daily life in Judea and Galilee. Join me as we unearth the true appearance of the first century. Have you ever wondered why the Bible strictly forbids mixing linen and wool in a single garment? To understand how they dressed 2,000 years ago, we must first get our hands dirty with the raw materials. In the first century, clothes weren't bought in a store. They were manufactured from fiber to dye in a process that could last months. Entering the world of textile materials in first-century Judea is to understand the economy, religion, and survival of a people. The foundation of everything was wool. If you could travel back in time and walk through the hills of Judea or the plains of Galilee, the first thing you would notice is the smell of sheep. Wool was the queen of fibers for a practical reason: the climate. Although we imagine Israel as a hot desert, the nights are freezing and winters in Jerusalem can be surprisingly harsh. The broad-tailed sheep, common in the region, was not only abundant but had thermal properties that protected from the scorching sun during the day and the biting cold at night. But obtaining that wool was an art. The process began with shearing, a community event that marked the seasons. It wasn't just about cutting hair, but about selecting the best fibers. The whitest and purest wool was reserved for gala garments or temple services, while darker or coarser fibers became the work clothes of shepherds and farmers. Once shorn, the wool had to be washed to remove lanolin, a sticky natural fat. This step was crucial. If it wasn't washed well, the dye wouldn't take. If it was washed too much, the fiber lost its water resistance. Next came carding, where the women of the house used wooden combs to align the fibers. This is where audience retention gets interesting, because we must imagine that in every house in Nazareth or Capernaum, the constant sound was that of the spinning spindle. Spinning was a task that accompanied Jewish women from dawn to dusk. They did it while walking to the well, while talking to their neighbors, or while watching the fire. They used a wooden spindle with a stone or clay weight called a whorl. The finer the thread, the wealthier the person who would wear the garment. A thick thread meant poverty. A thread as fine as a hair was the ultimate symbol of the Jerusalem aristocracy. But wool was not alone. Linen was the counterpoint of luxury and purity. Unlike wool, which came from the animal world, linen was extracted from the plant of the same name, grown mainly in the more humid areas of the Jordan Valley or imported from prestigious Egypt. Working linen was a much more laborious and expensive process. The stalks had to be soaked in water until the soft parts rotted, the fibers beaten to separate them, and then combed repeatedly. The result was a fresh fabric that didn't retain odors and shone with a natural white that wool could never achieve. Therefore, linen was the sacred fabric par excellence. The temple priests dressed exclusively in linen. Linen represented light, ritual cleanliness, and, above all, separation from the mundane. And here we come to one of the most fascinating curiosities of Jewish law: shatnez. The Torah explicitly forbade mixing linen and wool in the same cloth. To a modern spectator, this seems like an arbitrary rule, but for an inhabitant 2,000 years ago, it was a matter of cosmic order. Wool represents the animal kingdom and the sacrifice of Abel. Linen represents the vegetable kingdom and the offering of Cain. Mixing them was to break a sacred barrier. This prohibition forced tailors and weavers to be extremely careful. If a wool tunic was sewn with linen thread, the garment became invalid for an observant Jew. This distinction visually marked Jews against Romans or Greeks, who mixed fibers without hesitation for aesthetic or comfort reasons. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more content like this. That way, you'll always be up to date with our upcoming videos. Now, let's keep going. The power of color. Now, let's talk about what really gave life to clothes: color. Forget those movie images where everyone wears boring white or earth brown. The world of Jesus was a world saturated with color, although color came at a price. Common people dressed in the natural tones of their animals: creams, deep browns, grays, and blacks. But if you had a little money, you wanted to show it off through dye. The most famous and expensive dye in history is, without a doubt, Tyrian purple. It was obtained from thousands of small sea snails called murex. To dye a single tunic, thousands of these mollusks were needed, making the color purple literally more expensive than gold. Dressing in purple was a direct message to the world: I am someone powerful, probably related to royalty or the high aristocracy. However, there were other more accessible dyes that filled the streets with color. Red was obtained from cochineal or a root called madder, which gave a very popular earthy reddish tone. Blue was extracted from a plant called indigo or from a specific snail for the sacred blue of the Tolith. Yellow came from saffron or pomegranate peel. What we must understand is that color was not a random aesthetic choice, it was a statement of social status. A peasant who managed to dye the edge of his mantle a deep blue was investing his savings to show his devotion and dignity. The dyeing process was an industrial secret closely guarded by dyers' guilds, who usually lived in isolated neighborhoods due to the foul odor emitted by the fermentation vats, especially the purple ones, which smelled like rotten fish and ammonia. Once you had the thread spun and dyed, you moved to the loom. In the 1st century, the warp-weighted loom was the cutting-edge technology in homes. The fabric was woven from the top down. The most incredible thing about this process, and a detail that is often overlooked, is that clothes were woven to size on the loom. They didn't cut the fabric like we do today. Cutting fabric was considered a waste of material that had cost hundreds of hours to produce. Therefore, the size of the tunic was decided before weaving began. This leads us to a key archaeological detail: Jesus' famous seamless tunic mentioned in the Gospel of John. To weave such a garment required a special loom and superior technical skill. It wasn't necessarily a garment of extreme luxury in terms of material, but it was a masterpiece of textile craftsmanship, woven in one piece so it had no weak points and hung perfectly on the body. Finally, we must consider durability. In Jesus' time, a good quality tunic was not something you used for one season and threw away. It was a lifetime investment. Often, clothes were inherited from parents to children. They were patched, washed with extreme care using natural soaps and ashes, and protected from moths like treasure. When we look at the crowd listening to the Sermon on the Mount, we should not see a uniform group. We should see a mosaic of textures: the sheen of the rich man's linen, the density of the shepherd's virgin wool, the patches on the tunics of the poorest, and the vibrant colors of those who wanted to stand out in the midst of Roman oppression. Every thread, every fiber, and every drop of dye told a story of who that person was and what their place in the world was. Understanding the materials is the first step to stripping the Hollywood filter off history and starting to see the 1st century in all its tactical and colorful reality. Would you like to know how these fabrics were transformed into the specific garments that defined a man or a woman in Jerusalem? Well, get ready, because in the next section, we are going to analyze the garment that everyone wore, but no one used the same way: the tunic. The tunic, the social ID. Have you ever stopped to think that, in Jesus' world, wearing a tunic too short or too long could be the difference between being respected as a teacher or being humiliated as a slave? If the materials were the soul of the dress, the tunic was the body, the fundamental garment that every human being in the 1st century Mediterranean possessed, but which had social codes so strict that a single mistake in wearing it could completely change how others perceived you. Entering into the analysis of the tunic, known in the Greek world as chiton and in the Jewish sphere as haluk, is to open a window into daily life, modesty, and the functionality of an era where pants did not exist and where freedom of movement depended on a piece of cloth and a belt. The tunic was not simply a long shirt. Imagine a rectangular piece of fabric, usually wool or linen, that was folded and sewn, leaving openings for the head and arms. However, for a 1st century Jew, the tunic was their second skin. The first thing we must understand is the length. This was the main marker of class and trade. If you were a manual laborer, a fisherman in the Sea of Galilee, or a farmer in the wheat fields, your tunic rarely fell below the knees.
Why?
For a purely practical reason. Long fabric was a hindrance to physical work, it got muddy, caught on tools, and limited your stride. In contrast, if you saw someone walking through the streets of Jerusalem with a tunic grazing their ankles, you knew immediately you were looking at a man of leisure, a scholar, a scribe, or someone from the aristocracy who didn't need to perform physical labor to survive. This is where a fascinating concept enters that appears repeatedly in biblical texts: girding one's loins. To a modern spectator, this phrase sounds poetic or metaphorical, but 2,000 years ago, it was a vital physical action. When a man wearing a long tunic needed to run, fight, or work suddenly, he would take the bottom of his tunic, pull it between his legs, and tuck it under his belt. This instantly transformed the tunic into a sort of shorts or a reinforced diaper that freed the legs. It was the gesture indicating that rest time was over and action had begun. If Jesus told his disciples to have their loins girded, he was giving them a tactical instruction. Be ready to move fast, don't let your clothes hold you back. But the tunic didn't hang loose on the body like a modern nightgown. The belt, or zona, was the most important accessory. It wasn't a mere ornament, it was a multifunctional tool. Belts were usually made of leather or tightly woven cloth. They served to create a natural pouch in the chest by folding the excess fabric of the tunic over the belt. That space, called the bosom of the tunic, was the pocket of the ancient world. Money, small tools, bread for the road, or seeds for planting were kept there. In fact, when parables speak of receiving a good measure, pressed down and running over into your lap, they are referring to this space formed above the belt. The belt also served to carry a knife or a coin purse, and the quality of the leather or its embroidery said a lot about who the wearer was. A detail often omitted in artistic representations is that many people didn't wear just one tunic, but two. The inner tunic, lighter and made of linen, served to absorb sweat and protect the skin from the coarser wool of the outer tunic. That's why when John the Baptist said that whoever has two tunics should share with him who has none, he wasn't talking about excessive luxury, but a basic need for survival. Having two tunics meant having a clean change or an extra layer of warmth for winter nights. Being left with only one tunic was living on the edge of poverty, a sign of total dispossession. Let's talk now about an element that generates much curiosity and is key to the retention of this video: underwear. What was under those tunics? Archaeology and texts indicate that a garment called a sublegaculum, or a simple form of linen loincloth, was used. However, not everyone used it constantly. The concept of nudity in the first century was very different from ours. For a Jew of the time, being in a short tunic without a mantle was considered being naked in a social sense or being in work clothes. True physical nudity was an extreme shame, a taboo avoided at all costs, linking dress directly to the moral dignity of the person. The difference between a man's tunic and a woman's was subtle but fundamental. Although the basic structure was similar, women's tunics were invariably long to the feet and usually had more volume of fabric. A woman would never gird her loins the way a man did in public, as showing her legs was considered a serious lack of modesty. Additionally, women's tunics were often decorated with vertical bands called clavi. Although the Romans used these bands to indicate senatorial rank, in the Judean region, women adopted them for aesthetics, using colors like red or blue to break the monotony of the natural fabric. These bands weren't just decorative, they reinforced the seams and edges of the garment, ensuring it lasted through more years of heavy use. One of the most critical points for understanding the tunic in Jesus' time is the manufacturing technique I mentioned earlier: the one-piece woven tunic. Most lower-class tunics were made of two rectangles sewn at the shoulders and sides. This left a visible and often uncomfortable seam. But the seamless tunic, woven from the top down on a large loom, was the pinnacle of textile engineering. Having no seams meant the garment was stronger, fit the body better, and was visually much cleaner and more elegant. The fact that Jesus wore such a tunic at the time of his crucifixion has led many historians to debate. Some suggest it was a gift from one of the wealthy women who followed his ministry, as it wasn't a garment a Galilean carpenter would usually make for himself. The Roman soldiers, who knew the quality of fabrics, preferred to cast lots rather than tear it, giving us an idea of the real value such a piece of craftsmanship held. Another aspect that defined the use of the tunic was climate and hygiene. Washing clothes was an exhausting task that required taking garments to a water source, using soapwort roots or ashes, and beating the fabric against rocks. For this reason, the outer tunic was usually dark or natural colors to hide the dirt of the road, while the inner tunic, which was in contact with the body, was washed more frequently. The use of perfumes and oils wasn't just for vanity. In a culture where washing clothes was infrequent, strong scents helped mask body odors accumulated in the wool fibers. The tunic also had a political language. During festivals in Jerusalem, the city filled with different types of tunics clashing with each other. You could see the immaculate white tunic of a member of the Essene sect, symbolizing their search for extreme purity and their rejection of the material world. Beside them, you might see the luxurious tunic, perhaps with silk threads imported from the East, of a relative of the high priest's family. And among them, the simple, patched, and dusty tunic of a pilgrim who had walked for days from the Decapolis. The tunic was the social map of Israel. Before someone even opened their mouth to speak, their tunic had already told everyone how much money they had, how religious they were, and which political group they belonged to. To close this section, we must understand that the tunic was not a costume, but a tool of identity. Every time Jesus spoke about not worrying about what to wear, he did so in a context where clothes were a person's most expensive possession. Losing your tunic was losing your status, your protection against the elements, and your place in society. But even the most perfect tunic was incomplete. For a Jew, going out in the street only in a tunic was like going out today in your underwear. The garment that really made the difference between an ordinary man and a man of the covenant was missing. Did you know that the outer layer they put over the tunic was so sacred that the law forbade anyone from taking it from you overnight, even if you owed them a lot of money? Get ready, because now we are going to discover the secret of the mantle, the sacred fringes, and why a piece of blue cloth could be the key to a miracle. The mantle, a legal refuge and sacred symbol. Have you ever wondered why in ancient stories a sick person would risk being crushed by a crowd just to touch the edge of a teacher's mantle? To us, a coat is simply a garment to protect us from the weather, but 2,000 years ago, in 1st century Judea, the mantle was not just clothing, it was an extension of the personality, a legal refuge, and above all, the most sacred symbol of Jewish identity. If the tunic was what made you human and allowed you to work, the mantle, known as himation in Greek or talith in Hebrew, was what made you a citizen and a devotee. Understanding this garment is fundamental to understanding not only how they looked, but how they thought and interacted with the divine and the legal in a world where a piece of cloth could be your only possession of real value. The mantle was basically a large rectangle of heavy wool, usually in a natural, cream color or with dark stripes, wrapped around the body over the tunic. But we shouldn't imagine it as a superhero cape buttoned at the neck. It was worn in a specific way, thrown over the left shoulder, passed across the back, under the right arm, and thrown back over the left shoulder. This left the right arm free to gesture, work, or greet, while the rest of the body remained wrapped in a layer of thermal protection. On cold desert nights or in the winters of the Judean mountains, the mantle was literally your bed. In fact, the law of Moses was so protective of this garment that it explicitly forbade a creditor from keeping a debtor's mantle overnight. If someone lent you money and you gave your mantle as collateral, that person was bound by divine law to return it to you before the sun went down, because God knew that without that mantle, you could die of cold. This legal relationship gives us an idea that the mantle was the last bastion of human dignity. However, what truly made a Jew's mantle different from a Roman's or a Greek's wasn't the fabric itself, but what hung from its corners. This is where we enter the heart of religious identity, the tzitzit, or sacred fringes. According to the book of Numbers, the children of Israel were to put fringes on the edges of their garments so that, when they saw them, they would remember all the commandments of the Lord. These fringes were not simple aesthetic ornaments. Each knot and each thread had a numerical significance that summed up the value of divine laws. To an outside observer, a group of Jewish men walking through the market was immediately distinguished by those fringes striking their legs as they walked. It was a constant visual declaration, "We are a people apart, we are a people under a law." Within these fringes was a detail that today has been lost in most traditions, but which in Jesus' time was the center of a technological and theological industry: the thread of blue. The law required that in each group of fringes there be a cord of techlit blue. This blue wasn't just any dye. It was obtained from a specific sea snail, and its color was meant to imitate the blue of the sky at twilight, reminding them of the throne of God. The cost of this dye was so astronomical that only the wealthiest could afford a thread of pure blue. The poorest often wore white fringes, but the presence of that blue thread on a teacher's mantle was a symbol of supreme spiritual authority. That's why when the woman with the flow of blood seeks to touch the edge of Jesus' mantle, she isn't touching the fabric by chance. She is looking for the fringes, the point where law, identity, and holiness concentrated. In the mindset of the time, the power of a man of God resided, symbolically, in the edges of his authority, physically represented by those threads. Audience retention at this point usually increases upon discovering that the mantle was also a tool for social communication. The Pharisees, for example, were known for enlarging the fringes of their mantles. It wasn't a matter of fashion, but of religious exaggeration. By making the fringes longer and more visible, they were sending a message to the rest of the population: "I fulfill the law with more rigor than you. My commandments are larger and more visible." Jesus criticized this practice not because the fringes were bad, but because they were used as a tool of pride and social superiority. The mantle thus became a battlefield of status. While a humble Galilean fisherman wore a mantle of coarse wool with short, practical fringes, A member of the Sanhedrin in Jerusalem would sport a mantle of fine wool, dyed with expensive colors and with fringes that almost swept the ground, proving he didn't need to perform any physical labor that might soil his ritual purity. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss more content like this. That way, you'll always be up to date with our upcoming videos. Now, let's keep going. Another fascinating use of the mantle was ceremonial. When a prophet or teacher wanted to draw people's attention, he could cover his head with a mantle, creating a space of isolation and prayer even in the middle of a crowd. This is the origin of what we know today as the prayer toleth. In the 1st century, there was no clear distinction between the daily mantle and the prayer mantle. They were the same garment. The Jewish man lived his faith in his street clothes. If he had to take an oath, he could hold the fringe of his mantle. If he was in mourning, he would rend his mantle as a sign that his heart was broken, a dramatic and costly action given the value of the garment. Rending a mantle wasn't just an emotional gesture, it was a financial sacrifice that demonstrated the magnitude of the pain. The color of the mantle also told stories of resistance and occupation. While the Romans favored the white toga for citizens and red for soldiers, the Jews maintained a palette of colors that connected them to the land. However, we should not think everything was brown and gray. Archaeological finds in places like the Masada Caves or the Dead Sea have revealed fragments of mantles with vibrant colored stripes, greens, yellows, and deep reds. Women, in particular, used mantos that could also serve as veils, wrapping themselves in such a way as to protect their modesty and their skin from the sun. A well-worn female mantle was a work of art of folds and drapes that indicated her family's position and her respect for local customs. But perhaps the most shocking thing for a modern spectator is to understand the mantle as an object of refuge. When Jesus talks about if someone takes your tunic, you should give him your mantle as well, he is asking for something radically subversive. Giving the mantle meant being left practically naked and without protection against the world. It was an act of total surrender that broke all the schemes of the time. To the 1st century mindset, being left without a mantle was losing social identity. A man without a mantle was a pariah, someone who had nowhere to sleep and no way to prove his connection to his people's covenant. In summary, the mantle was much more than a cape. It was a border between the individual and the world, a physical reminder of God, and a tool for legal survival. Every time you see a representation of this era, look at how they wear the mantle. If it's clean, long, and decorated, you are seeing power. If it's dirty, short, and patched, you are seeing the daily struggle of common people. But in both cases, those fringes on the corners tell the same story of a people who wanted to wear their faith not just in their hearts, but sewn into every thread of their clothing. Now that we understand how they covered their bodies and what their mantles meant, we need to look down and up. How did they manage to walk miles over rocky and desert terrain without destroying their feet? And what did they wear on their heads to survive the Judean sun? Get ready, because what they wore on their feet and the care they gave their hair will reveal details about hygiene and physical resistance that will leave you totally surprised. From head to toe, sandals and head coverings. Have you ever wondered why the act of washing a guest's feet was considered the most humble and necessary show of hospitality in Jesus' world, to the point of being a task reserved exclusively for the lowest-ranking slaves? To understand life in the 1st century, we have to lower our gaze to the ground, to that stony, dusty, and burning Judean terrain that physically marked the bodies of its inhabitants. In this section, we are going to explore what they wore from head to toe, because although the tunic and mantle gave status, it was the sandals and the head covering that allowed survival in one of the Roman Empire's most implacable climates. Understanding how they protected their extremities reveals not only their technology but also their concepts of respect, holiness, and physical endurance. Let's start with footwear, because in Jesus' time, walking wasn't an option. It was the only form of existence for the vast majority. The sandal was the most basic and vital piece of engineering. If today we choose shoes for fashion, they chose them for traction and durability. The standard sandal consisted of a thick sole made of several layers of cow or camel leather, sewn together with animal tendons or reinforced linen threads. What made the Jewish sandal unique was its fastening design. Unlike Roman sandals, which often went up the calf with intricate leather ties, the sandal of a Galilee inhabitant was simpler but functional. A leather strap passed between the first and second toes and joined other straps that surrounded the heel and the instep. This design allowed the foot to breathe in 40-degree heat, but offered enough protection so that the sharp stones of the road wouldn't destroy the sole of the foot. However, wearing sandals had a physical cost. dust. In a world of dirt roads shared with pack animals, feet were always dirty. That's why sandals were never worn inside a house. Leaving sandals at the door wasn't just a matter of cleanliness. It was a symbol of leaving the outside world and its impurities outside the home. This is where footwear crosses with theology. When God tells Moses to take off his sandals because the place he stands is holy ground, he establishes a code that was still in effect in Jesus' time. Entering the Temple of Jerusalem, or a sacred space barefoot, was to recognize that there were no barriers between the human being and divine creation. But on the street, the sandal was your armor. A man without sandals was a man in absolute misery, someone who couldn't even afford basic leather for protection, which immediately made him an object of social pity. Now, let's look up toward the head, because in the 1st century Near East, going out in the street bare-headed under the midday sun was a recipe for disaster. We often imagine biblical characters with large, elaborate turbans, but reality was more pragmatic. Most men used a sudarium, which was basically a cloth of linen or light wool placed over the head and secured with a braided wool cord. This cloth fulfilled 3 critical functions. It protected the neck from sunburn, absorbed sweat from the forehead before it reached the eyes, and could be wrapped around the face during sandstorms to allow breathing. The color was usually white or the natural tone of the fiber to reflect sunlight. But hair and beard were the true protagonists of the face. For a Jewish man, a beard wasn't an aesthetic choice, it was a sign of maturity and manly dignity. A well-groomed beard, trimmed but not shaved, was the pride of a family man. A complete shave was seen as something foreign, characteristic of Romans or Egyptians, and was often associated with effeminacy or loss of national identity. Jews took their facial hair so seriously that touching another man's beard was a gesture of extreme trust or, if done with violence, an insult that could end in a serious conflict. Hair, for its part, was kept at a moderate length. The idea of Jesus with extremely long hair, as we see in Renaissance paintings, clashes with the customs of the time, where very long hair was usually reserved for those who took a Nazirite vow, like Samson or John the Baptist. For the common man, hair was cut periodically to avoid lice plagues, which were a constant problem in the ancient world. As for women, the head covering was even more significant. The veil wasn't just a piece of clothing, it was a boundary of privacy. In Judean culture, a married woman's hair was considered something intimate, reserved for the eyes of her husband and immediate family. Going out in the street without covering her hair was considered a lack of respect for herself and her home. It wasn't about the full veils we see in some modern cultures, but light mantles that fell elegantly over the shoulders, allowing the face to be seen but maintaining the modesty of the hairstyle. High-class women used gold or silver thread nets and small headbands to secure these veils, while country women simply used the end of their own mantle to cover themselves when entering public or sacred spaces. A detail that often surprises is the use of cosmetics and oils in combination with clothing. In a dry climate, skin cracks and hair becomes brittle. Therefore, the use of scented olive oil was a basic hygienic necessity. Anointing the head with oil, as mentioned in the Psalms and the Gospels, was what we would call a beauty and health treatment today. It helped keep hair under control, protected the skin from the sun, and provided a pleasant scent that combated the smell of sweat accumulated in the sudarium. When a host received a guest, he not only offered water to wash their feet of road dirt, but also oil for their head. If you skipped these steps, you were telling your guest they weren't welcome. Hygiene also extended to the care of sandals. Leather, under constant sun and contact with stream water, tends to harden and break. Therefore, sandals were regularly rubbed with animal fat to keep them flexible. A well-maintained pair of sandals could last years, becoming a traveler's faithful companion. It is fascinating to think that when Jesus sent his disciples out 2 by 2 and told them not to carry extra footwear, he was asking for absolute trust in providence and the hospitality of strangers, because on those roads, a broken sandal could mean the end of the journey. Toward the end of the day, the ritual of undressing revealed the importance of these garments. By removing the sudarium, the sandals, and washing off the dust, the first-century inhabitant performed a transition from the world of the struggle for survival to the world of family rest. The sandals stayed by the door, the sudarium was folded, and the body, marked by leather straps and the sun, finally rested. These elements, so small compared to a large mantle, were what truly connected the human being to the earth they walked upon. But all this clothing we have analyzed, from wool fibers to leather sandals, was not the same for everyone. Jesus' world was not an egalitarian society, and clothing was the cruelest tool for marking distance. How could you distinguish a prince from a beggar 100 meters away in a crowded street in Jerusalem? Get ready, because in the next section, we are going to enter the social spectrum of the first century, analyzing how the extreme luxury of some and the absolute poverty of others created a visual contrast that explains many of the conflicts and parables that have come down to our day. The social spectrum, princes and beggars. Have you ever wondered if it would be possible to know how much money someone has in their bank account just by looking at the hem of their clothes from 50 meters away? In first-century Judea, there were no credit cards or luxury brand logos, but clothing functioned as an implacable social scanner that classified every individual into a perfectly defined hierarchy. If you could fly over the streets of Jerusalem during a festival, you would see an ocean of textiles telling the story of a society deeply divided between absolute luxury and extreme survival. Understanding the social spectrum through clothing is the key to understanding why Jesus' messages about humility and wealth caused such an impact in his time. It wasn't just a matter of morality, it was a matter of daily visual contrast. Let's start at the lowest end of the pyramid, the working class and the poor. For a fisherman in the Sea of Galilee or a laborer in the vineyards, clothes were a tool for work, not an ornament. Their dress was reduced to the strictly necessary. These men wore short tunics of coarse wool, often in natural colors like taupe or yellowish-brown, because dyeing clothes was a luxury they couldn't afford. The most characteristic aspect of their dress was wear and tear. Tunics were full of patches and mending. A detail that usually escapes historical reconstructions is that a first-century worker's clothes smelled of their trade: fish, earth, sweat, and would smoke. Their belts were simple hemp ropes or strips of worn leather. For them, the concept of fashion didn't exist. Clothing was a possession so precious that it was used until it literally fell apart into rags, at which point the fragments were used as wicks for oil lamps or as cleaning cloths. At the opposite extreme, we find the elite of Jerusalem, the Sadducees and the priestly aristocracy. Here, clothing stops being protection and becomes political language. These men did not wear coarse wool, but fine linen imported from Egypt or even silk brought from eastern routes, something extremely rare and expensive. Their tunics were of such a dazzling white that they seemed to emit their own light, an effect achieved through chemical bleaching processes with sulfur that common people could not afford. But what truly defined the elite was the color purple. As we mentioned earlier, wearing purple was the ultimate declaration of power. A purple mantle cost more than a peasant earned in his entire life. When Jesus told the parable of the rich man and Lazarus, he specifically mentioned that the rich man dressed in purple and fine linen. To his audience, that wasn't a generic description. It was the exact image of the ruling caste they saw passing through the city's high streets while they barely covered their bodies with rough fabrics. A fascinating intermediate group was the Pharisees. Their dress was a walking theological manifesto. Although not all were rich, their clothes screamed devotion. They were known for enlarging their phylacteries, or tefillin, small leather boxes containing law texts tied to the forehead and arm. While an ordinary Jew might wear discreet phylacteries, the Pharisees made them large and striking so that no one could doubt their piety. Similarly, their fringes, or tzitzit, were longer and more elaborate. Seeing a Pharisee walk through the market was like seeing a choreography of sacred textiles in motion. Every step they took was designed so that the swaying of their fringes reminded everyone present of the importance of the commandments. It was a form of spiritual superiority expressed through fashion design. But we cannot forget the element that reminded all Jews they were under occupation: the Roman soldier. The visual contrast between a Jew and a legionary was total. The soldier wore a red wool tunic, a color symbolizing blood and Mars, the god of war. Over it, the larica segmentata, or iron plate armor, shone under the sun, creating a metallic effect that contrasted with the softness of civilian fabrics. The soldier's belt, the cingulum, was decorated with metal studs that made a characteristic noise when walking, a sound that instilled fear in local populations. While Jewish footwear was a light sandal, the Roman caliga was a heavy military boot with nails in the sole that left a metallic footprint in the dirt and sounded like an iron march on the pavement of Jerusalem streets. The Roman soldier was a spot of red and metal in the middle of a people of earth tones and linen. Women also experienced this social spectrum dramatically. A woman of the Herodian nobility wore layers of transparent veils, used imported cosmetics like antimony for her eyes, and adorned herself with gold jewelry, pearls, and precious stones. Her dress was designed to show that she didn't have to perform any domestic tasks. In contrast, a woman of the people, like those who followed Jesus from Galilee, wore dark-colored tunics that hid the stains of daily work: cooking, weaving, cleaning, and carrying water. Her jewelry was simple glass beads or bronze rings, and her hands, hardened by work, were the true accessory that defined her. However, in the religious sphere, modesty leveled the playing field a bit, as both the rich and the poor had to cover themselves respectfully when entering the temple. It is in this context that Jesus' teachings take on a revolutionary meaning. When he says that the lilies of the field are dressed better than Solomon in all his glory, he is directly attacking his era's obsession with visual status. Solomon was the gold standard of Jewish luxury, the man who personified the most expensive fabrics and heaviest jewelry. By comparing a flower's natural beauty to a king's clothes, Jesus was subverting the fashion hierarchy of his time. He was saying that a person's value didn't reside in their loom's capacity to produce fine threads or a dyer's skill in extracting purple from a snail, but in something internal that clothes often hid. Clothing also played a crucial role in moments of social transition. When someone was expelled from the community or fell into disgrace, their clothes were the first thing to reflect it. Lepers, for example, were required by law to wear their garments torn and their heads bare or covered in a specific way that indicated their impurity. It was a visual stigma that isolated them before they could get near anyone. On the other hand, at a wedding, even the poorest tried to get a festive garment, often borrowing or saving for years, because presenting oneself at a banquet in work clothes was the ultimate insult to the host. In short, dress in Jesus' time was a textile caste system. Every knot, every dye, and every length of fabric was a message sent to the rest of society. Observing this spectrum, from the metallic sheen of Rome to the immaculate white of the temple and the dusty patches of the peasant, we understand that clothes weren't just something they put on in the morning, they were the armor with which they faced a world of brutal hierarchies. The next time you read these stories, don't imagine a uniform world. Imagine a constant clash of colors, textures, and status that defined who lived in luxury and who struggled for daily bread. We have covered materials, tunics, mantles, footwear, and social differences. But we are left with the final question: what remains of all this today? How has the clothing of 2,000 years ago influenced what we see today in churches, in art, and in our own culture? Get ready for the conclusion of this documentary, because we are going to see how the legacy of those Judean threads is still alive in the 21st century in ways you never would have imagined. Conclusion: the legacy in the 21st century. How is it possible that the fashion of a small province of the Roman Empire from 2,000 years ago still dictates today the way millions of people dress in religious ceremonies and gala events in the middle of the 21st century? At the end of this journey through the closets of the past, we discover that the threads of Judea did not fade with time, but were woven directly into the DNA of our Western culture. What began as a need for survival in the desert and an expression of strict theological laws ended up becoming the visual standard for the sacred. If you walk into a church or synagogue today, or even if you observe academic robes at a university graduation, you are seeing direct echoes of the clothing that Jesus and his contemporaries wore in the streets of Jerusalem. The most evident legacy is found in liturgical vestments. The albs, stoles, and mantles used by priests in various Christian traditions are direct evolutions of the Romano-Jewish tunic and himation. What was street clothes in the 1st century froze in time over the centuries to preserve a sense of solemnity and connection to origins. But the impact goes beyond religion. The concept of the one-piece tunic, which we analyzed as a masterpiece of craftsmanship, influenced European tailoring for generations, always seeking that perfect drape of fabric symbolizing integrity and purity. Even the idea that long clothing represents authority and wisdom remains. We think of judges, magistrates, and doctors who still use evolved versions of those ancient mantles to project respect and social distance. In the Jewish world, the persistence is even more amazing. The talith used today for prayer is, in essence, the same mantle Jesus would have worn to the temple, maintaining the same fringes, or tzitzit, that served as a visual reminder of the commandments. This garment has survived exiles, persecutions, and technological changes, proving that clothing can be a refuge of identity stronger than any geographical border. But perhaps the deepest legacy is the paradigm shift that occurred in that era regarding modesty and simplicity. The idea that excessive adornment hides the true essence of the human being, a constant critique in the era's teachings against the opulence of the elites, laid the foundations for an aesthetic of sobriety that has influenced artistic and philosophical movements to the present day. Today, when we watch a movie or visit a museum, we no longer look at those tunics as mere costumes. Now we know that every fold, every snail dye, and every leather sandal tells a story of resistance, faith, and social structure. We have learned that dressing 2,000 years ago was an act of constant communication with God and with men. By understanding how they dressed, we have achieved something much more important. We have humanized the people who walked those dusty paths, stripping away the marble filter of statues to see them as flesh and blood beings who cared about the cold, status, and the dignity of their appearance. The clothing of Jesus' time reminds us that, although fashions change and empires fall, the human need to express who we are through what we wear remains exactly the same. If this journey through the centuries has helped you see history through different eyes, don't forget to subscribe to keep discovering the best-kept secrets of antiquity. Which garment of all those we analyzed today surprised you the most? Tell me in the comments, and let's keep the conversation going.